Hello, guys. So today we're going to talk about something that's been in the news recently for a while. Well, I guess since 1619 in America, but it's recently popular. Every generation experiences this period of racial turmoil. And I think the perfect way to start is to disabuse the audience and ourselves of what racism is and what we believe to be systematic racism or racism in general, because a lot of people have the misconception that as long as you don't hate anyone of another race or color or ethnicity or gender or sexual identification, then you're cool, you're not racist or you're not prejudiced. So let's start with Rashad. Tell me how you define racism and what it means to you.
Well, I think about racism both as individual and structural. The sort of ways in which we engage individually, which is oftentimes where people stop. The sort of things that a person can do from whether or not they rent a room to someone or whether or not they hire someone in the workplace. And then sort of at the sort of larger level, a whole set of rules and systems that are designed to benefit one group or another. Racism at the end of the day comes down to power. And it comes down to who has power to dictate the terms of another community or another person based on simply who they are.
Right. And so, Wrinkle, tell me, how do you see that intersecting with, I know you work not only in the space of race, but, with the idea of intersectionality with gender and sex and sexual identification. So tell me how you see those power dynamics that Rashad talked about playing out on a larger scale.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I think that gender, patriarchy, sexism, and homophobia and classism work similarly to the way racism works. And all of those issues, you've got a combination of attitudes, feelings, plus institutionalized power, the power to actually make your feelings the way that things run, the basis of how things run. What I like to do in looking at any situation is just to take different lenses to it. Take a racial lens to it, a gender lens to it, a class lens to it. And when you look at any given institution, the police, for example, or public health systems, a hospital, a school, when you look at it from all these different lenses, you're going to surface the ways that different people are experiencing problems and abuse of power in that situation. And using one lens doesn't mean that you've wiped out the effect of another lens. It's perfectly possible to have a racial analysis, a gender analysis, and to have plans for making change on multiple fronts in any particular institution or system.
And Sia Bulela, I know you're kind of an expert on one of the purest and most extreme forms of this kind of inequality internationally in our lifetimes. And so tell me about how you see what you've written recently about how you see the reflections of South Africa's past in America. And so talk about that and how you see, the remnants of South African apartheid in America.
Thank you, Michael, for that question. In fact, I would argue that before even the apartheid system was initiated and applied in South Africa, racism has always and will always be existing within the political system, economic system, and all systems that govern the world as we know it today. If you look at what slavery is, slavery was built upon the foundation of racism. Apartheid was built upon the foundation of racism. Colonialism itself was built upon the foundation of racism. So if you look at segregation and slavery in the United States, it's a complete replica of what apartheid was in South Africa. So it is a matter of historical fact that apartheid in South Africa was modeled on segregation and colonialism and slavery in the United States, the Indian Act in Canada, the Nazi regime in Germany, and all the different systems that have been designed. In fact, apartheid was modeled on those systems. It was only initiated in South Africa in 1948 when the Boers took over from the English. But it is a system that has already been in existence even before the 1916. The white man arrived in South Africa in 1652. Already there was slavery happening in the United States. Already there was segregation built upon the foundation of racism. And it later on followed with the fascist regime of Mussolini in Italy, the regime of Hitler, the Nazi regime of Hitler in Germany, the Indian Act in Canada, colonialism in Africa. So apartheid was in fact modeled upon all these systems that governed the world and that continues to govern how the world moves even in this day and age.
And I think it's important to marry like all three of those comments together and point out that, you know, a lot of, you know, in each of your answers, what we see is that it's racism. It's not, racism is built on power, not necessarily the majority. You know, whites in South Africa were outnumbered, but because of the power dynamic, it allowed racism to govern an entire society. And I think that kind of marries what Rashad mentioned and what Wrinkle mentioned and what you mentioned. And Rashad, when you think about the power dynamics, you know, even though, you know, we continue to fight for equality and equity and freedom, do you think a disassociation from power, in other words, how will that play out if the same people are in power? Do you think it's possible to eliminate this kind of institutional this institutional racism in America without eliminating the power dynamic?
No. Well, I mean, because institutions are built on power. So, you know, I think it's great. I mean, even when I am such a fan of everyone here's work, and each of you in different ways have talked about this. When I read your work, Michael, in The Root, and you're really sort of taking on individuals, sometimes you are really connecting it always back to powers and systems and where they get that. I think the challenge sometimes in our media age, in our cultural age, is the incentive structures of focusing on individuals. And all of you have focused so much on structures. And why that's important here is because we mistake far too often presence for power. Visibility and awareness, retweets and storytelling for actually the ability to change the rules, the written rules and the unwritten rules. And so when we mistake presence for power, when we think that we have done something we haven't, when we've gotten sort of black faces in high places, or when we've gotten sort of celebrities that America loves, we think that a black president means that we have gotten to the point where we have ended systemic racism. We think that a pop star that announces she's pregnant and the internet stops means that America loves black people as much as it loves black culture, and America can love black culture and hate black people at the same time. And those two things don't have to actually be in conflict, because power is constantly about forcing structures and systems to always realign. The sort of great Shirley Sherrod talked about racism as a shapeshifter. Right, and so the poll taxes of the sort of 20s and 30s become the voter ID laws, right? The Jim Crow becomes mass incarceration. And so if we're not constantly raising the floor on what's acceptable, and we do that through campaigns, we do that through challenging structures, we do that through forcing those in power to be nervous about disappointing us, and as a result, having to actually do things that are different. The final thing I will say about this is that, you know, when we mistake presence for power, we oftentimes also get into this thing was when people want to come in and help. When people want to come in and do things to be supportive, they end up landing at the wrong place. And so we end up getting people that sort of land at sort of charitable solutions to structural problems. And what I mean by that is mentorship programs instead of actually ending the systemic systems that have held people back. Oh, we need to fix the pipelines and do mentorship programs so those people can actually like be prepared to deal with a racist system that we are unwilling to change. We should celebrate ourselves, corporations, for sending water bottles to Flint instead of actually paying our fair share of taxes so that those communities can actually have clean pipes. We should do service days at inner city schools, but not actually ever interrogate why are certain schools not actually have the resources that they need. And so part of all of this is that when we don't actually have a clear power analysis, we have a lot of folks sort of playing extracurricular activities in justice, and those extracurricular activities in justice don't actually lead to real change because they are sort of playing around on the edges and not actually dealing with the structures.
Right, and Rico, I know you've worked in so many of these intersecting areas. What do you think it is necessary to kind of do what Rashad says and condition people and prepare them for this fight versus a kind of gradualism that is not symbolic, but it just makes the people who are carrying signs and doing performative work feel more comfortable in existing in this system. So what do you think is necessary to get the people to the place that we need?
You know, I think one of the things I like to say is that only power is power. So we're fond of saying, for example, that information is power. Information is important, but information is not power. Only power is power. And the way you build power is that you organize. You try not to be by yourself doing anything. You talk to your friends, you talk to your colleagues. I hear from a lot of people who are not Black, for example, and who want to be supportive of their colleagues in their workplaces, their Black colleagues, their colleagues of color. And they ask me, what should I do? And I'm like, go talk to your colleagues of color and find out what collectively you can demand, what you can propose that is a change in your organization system, and do it together. So I think the first mistake people make is they try to do things by themselves, and by ourselves, we're always going to be less powerful than with other people. So we have to organize, and through organizing, you build the muscle for sitting with conflict, for being rejected and trying again, for coming up with good solutions that are actually going to help solve problems for everybody. So organize, and organize some more while you're reading books and going to protests, and then going home to figure out how to make whichever system you're in, whether it's a school, a hospital, a neighborhood, a food bank, a church, a mosque, every system can help solve problems for everybody, but no one can do it by themselves.
Sia Bulela, you've studied these kinds of instances internationally. Do you believe that we can make a gradual shift toward a non-racist society, or do you think it has to be kind of a revolutionary tilt that upsets the system and all at once? Do you think we can move incrementally, or do you think the necessity of removing power, it necessitates a big revolution?
Well, Michael, I think it's critical before I even move into that particular question to just first clarify one thing here. We are engaging on a debate in terms of looking at how the direction of this conversation, it speaks into power, and it speaks into those who are ruling us. And in fact, it's critical that we put a face into what we mean as a system and what we mean as power. In the context of this debate, power means white supremacy, and the system means white privilege. So it's critical for us to just underline those and put things into perspective. So now for me, insofar as how I perceive things, and based on the experience of South Africa, I would say the only way we can be able to fully address the challenges of racism as they face the world today is if we take a radical shift, the gradual shift that everyone has been hoping for and everyone has been waiting for. In fact, South Africa has proven that it does not work. The Mandela administration in 1994 came in and ushered us in a democratic dispensation, hoping to unite the South African community, both black, white, and otherwise. 25 years later, since the dawn of the democratic dispensation, from apartheid into democracy, we are still fighting the same struggles that our forefathers, that the generation of Nelson Mandela and generations before them have been engaging on. In South Africa, was still fighting the same racism that Nelson Mandela was sent to prison for almost 27 years, together with his generation. So the gradual move and the gradual shift that everyone has been talking about, that everyone has been hoping, South Africa has proven that it does not work. In fact, the recent study, according to the World Bank, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. 25 years later, since the dawn of democracy, South Africa is one of the mostly divided countries. The racial parities and how the economy is skewed according to racial lines in the country, in fact, indicates to the world that the gradual shift, as anticipated by those wages struggling in South Africa against the apartheid regime, as anticipated by the generation of Nelson Mandela, it doesn't really work. So therefore, we need a radical shift and a change in attitudes to those whom we consider as in position of power. As I've indicated in the earlier on, here we have to be critical to put things into perspective. Power means whiteness. Power means white supremacy. Power means racism. And the only people who are able to continue that system of white privilege, that system of white system, is only the white people. So therefore, there has to be an attitude shift, and also it has to be a radical shift. It cannot be gradual. South Africa has proven 25 years later, since the dawn of democracy, that in fact, graduality insofar as confronting racism, insofar as confronting white supremacy, it does not work. Only radical shift can work. If you go back to South Africa today, the black people are angry. The black people are still calling for the land that was stolen since 1912. And that land has not been given back to them. Those who are in position of power, white supremacists, and people who are racist, they are refusing to give back what is not theirs. And they still consider themselves as a superior race and consider anything that is black as an inferior race, and therefore must continue being in a state of perpetual servitude to the white man. So therefore, there's only one way in which we can deal with this, being radical with it, and it only needs the radical shift, Michael.
Rinko, so hearing hearing that, and marrying that with what you said earlier, one of my contentions is that Black people cannot solve racism, right? It's there, Black people didn't invent it. Black people don't perpetuate white supremacy. So do you have the same mind? Do you think that there is something that Black people can do to eliminate this problem, or is it solely or mostly on white people?
Well, the main thing that Black people can do is define what racial justice is. You wouldn't want white people doing that, right? So setting out the vision for what is actually the right amount of change, and what kind of change, and what kind of policies, what kinds of revolutions and systems, like elections, schools, taxes. are wonky, but they control so much of what happens. So I would not want white people like having sole responsibility for coming up with what the change should be and then making it. I agree that given the enormous amounts of power they hold, without their action, without white action, things are not going to change. But Black people need to define that change. Otherwise, we're going to get a white version of racial justice, which is not, I think, going to work. Or we've had that, you know, all this incrementalism that we've been talking about is the white vision of how racial justice comes to be. And Black folks and other people of color, we need to be driving that vision and that definition and setting those standards. And then we can work together with everyone else who is about getting the society to meet them.
Rashad, we have like a minute left. Do you see do you think that the majority of white people know what the definition of racial justice looks like or how it should look?
No. And I think far too often people think of, even the most progressive white people think of racial justice as a kind of charity that they do, like a moral thing, which is right. But they oftentimes don't think about racial justice as strategic in their ability to actually win the things that they want to. So many of the norms and structures in our country that prevent us from being able to actually protect our planet, from being able to have healthcare for all, from being able to have systems where we have clean water and clean air. So many of the things that are holding us back are rooted in racial injustice. Racial injustice becomes the driver for it. And so racial justice will be the driver to actually undo it. I also think that the thing I kind of want to end on is that lots of times we are far too often talking about Black folks in this sort of space of pain, because so much of this work and so much of what we are seeing right now is Black pain. But Black people are the protagonists in the American story of justice, of freedom, of voting, of education. No one has fought harder and done more to make America better and greater and more on the right track to being the type of country where we live up to the ideals in the papers. And so we also, as much as we talk about sort of Black pain, we need to talk about Black joy, which is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration. We need to be talking about Black brilliance and Black creativity and all of the ways in which Black folks have continued to remake and make this country great. And that also has to be about the story of justice, because justice is not simply a set of policies. Justice is also a set of stories that we tell ourselves, that we retell ourselves about who we are as a country and what we want as a country. And so part of how I constantly think about how do we get not just to justice, but to freedom, it is about constantly not just retelling a story, but undoing the stories that we've told ourselves. And that is how we get to a new framework. And I think that is how we get to the type of progress that our communities deserve and that this moment requires.
Well, I think that's the perfect way to end our session. I want to thank you guys for all the work that you do, first of all, and for having this conversation today.